What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday. Hope everybody did have a happy holiday. It's time to go over the wide receiver starts and sits heading into week 12. You don't need me to tell you, the playoffs are extremely close, so it is crunch time. Making the correct start and sit decisions is very, very impactful down the stretch. As per usual, we will be going matchup by matchup, letting you know a bit about how we feel about each player, the area in which we have them ranked. But if you do have two players and you're not sure exactly which to start, we would recommend going to our rankings. Those are available at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website not only gain access to the rankings, you get all of our waiver information, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So if that interests you, once again, go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. With that being said, though, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which quarterback outside the top 15 in fantasy football is the only QB to have thrown at least 20 touchdown passes. The correct answer is Kirk Cousins. Congratulations to Jace, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which quarterback currently has the most drop passes on his attempts? Once again, that's which quarterback currently leads the league in dropped passes. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into the first matchup. The first matchup we have, of course, is Baltimore on the road against Pittsburgh. The big news here, of course, is that Lamar Jackson, he did test positive for coronavirus. This leaves presumably Robert Griffin III to take over as the starting quarterback, but really, even though it is big news for the league, very impactful for how this game will play out, it really doesn't affect us all that much for fantasy. The only wide receiving target that we really were considering starting has been Marquise Brown on this team. Marquise Brown is actually coming off a game in which he posted a complete dud, zeros across the board in every area except for targets, in which he had 3. This was a matchup, of course, against Tennessee, who's been giving it up to the wide receiver position, so it's safe to say we're not starting Marquise Brown against Pittsburgh this week. On the other side of the ball for Pittsburgh, 3 receivers in play as per usual: Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, as well as Juju Smith-Schuster. We would have them ranked in that exact order: Claypool and Deontay as those wide receiver 2s, Juju Smith-Schuster more of a wide receiver 3. Just keep in mind, in the last matchup, since of course these two teams are divisional, when we did see them play last, both Juju and Chase Claypool found success. Meanwhile, Deontay Johnson, he did struggle and only played in 1 quarter before getting knocked out due to injury. When it does come to Deontay, although he did put in one of his worst performances, he was still much more injured back then and has now had double-digit targets in 6 of 9 games this year. The next matchup, we have the Tennessee Titans on the road against the Indianapolis Colts. This game has a 51.5 point projected total, which I will say is pretty high considering both of these teams. Indianapolis is the favorite by about 3 points, which does promote a positive passing game script for the Tennessee Titans. Just keep in mind though, the Indianapolis Colts defense is really strong against opposing wide receivers. Only 2 quarterbacks have actually been able to throw a touchdown pass to a wide receiver over the past 5 weeks, one of them being Aaron Rodgers. In turn, the ceiling for both Tennessee Titans receivers that we would consider starting, Corey Davis, AJ Brown, it is going to be a bit lower, but specifically Corey Davis, in these tougher matchup games for wide receivers, we typically see him fed at a higher rate. So Davis, you can feel comfortable putting him in your flex spot, not so much as a high upside player, but definitely more of a floor play this week. As for AJ Brown, we have him ranked as a solid wide receiver 2 option. The last time these two teams faced though, it wasn't very pretty for him, just 1 reception, but look for him to break that trend in their second matchup. On the other side of the ball though, Michael Pittman is coming off of 2 phenomenal games since returning from injury. He is shaping up to be the most reliable wide receiver option on this Indianapolis Colts team, a team led by Phillip Rivers, who has been trending upward towards the second half of the season. Michael Pittman Bateman, he is ranked just outside the top 30, which brings him into more of that wide receiver 3 conversation, but definitely a player you could put in the flex. He's unlikely to dud and still has a pretty solid amount of upside. The next matchup we have Carolina Panthers on the road against Minnesota. This game has a projected total of 51 points. Minnesota, as we know, they really give it up to the wide receiver position. And Teddy Bridgewater, while there were some questions as to whether he would start last week due to injury, he carries no injury designation heading into this matchup. That means all 3 receivers for Carolina, they are in play. Curtis Samuel, definitely more of the player you would want to trust in the flex, even in a good matchup. We know they have the ability to find success with their main receivers, that being Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. Both receivers will come into this matchup ranked as back-end wide receiver 2s, but 2 players who have a ton of upside nonetheless. Both of these 2 receivers, they rank as high-end wide receiver 2s across the season, and there have only been 2 games this season where Minnesota has not allowed a receiving touchdown to wide receivers. On the other side of the ball, Adam Thielen has been put on the COVID reserve list, leaving Justin Jefferson as the only real wide receiver we can trust. Unfortunately, we can't say that this skyrockets Justin Jefferson in the rankings because the defense will be able to sell out in order to stop him. We still have him ranked though as a back-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2, so if you own him, make sure to get him into your lineup. The next matchup we have is the LA Chargers on the road against the Buffalo Bills. This game has one of the highest projected totals on the week, coming in at 53.5 points. The LA Chargers are projected to be playing from behind, which promotes a very positive passing game script for both Mike Williams as well as Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, we know, is an auto lock as a wide receiver 1 each and every week, and Mike Williams, he's coming off of one of his better games on the season, so despite Buffalo being a bit stingy against fantasy wide receivers, Mike Williams is still in play as a solid upside flex player. For Buffalo, being home favorites doesn't help their passing game script. The LA Chargers are also stingy to wide receivers, even much more so than that of Buffalo, so we need to be weary about starting anybody outside of Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs, of course, too hot to sit. He's coming off of a 10 reception game, has had double-digit targets in 4 of his past 6 games, so our expectations, a wide receiver 1 performance, but both John Brown and Cole Beasley, we do have bumped out even outside of that flex territory. The next matchup we have is the Cleveland Browns. They're on the road against the Jacksonville Jaguars. While both of these teams rank inside the top 10 at allowing fantasy points to wide receivers, it's really difficult to trust any of the wide receivers in this matchup. For Jacksonville, they are coming in as heavy underdogs even at home, but we still have to wonder exactly what's going to happen at their quarterback position with Mike Glennon scheduled to be the starter. The only Jacksonville receiver we have ranked as a starter currently is DJ Chark, but DJ Chark did miss a couple practices this week, which does put into question the thought of whether he will play or not. If he doesn't, we can't say for certain we would trust any Jacksonville receiver, even in a positive matchup, because there are simply too many question marks surrounding them, and for a lot of people out there, these games are very meaningful for your playoff aspirations. If Chark does play, high-end wide receiver 3 numbers are something we can expect. He will of course have upside, but his floor is going to be extremely low due to the risks surrounding him. On the other side of the ball, we have a similar case when it comes to risk versus reward, Jarvis Landry being the only receiver we would consider starting, and even with him, he's had 2+ matchups from the receiver standpoint. Against Philly last week, he only had 2 receptions, and even the week before that against Houston, he only had 3. The floor and the ceiling for him, it's questionable at best, so while you could start him in the flex, I would still look for a better option considering there are no bye weeks this week. The next matchup we have is the New York Giants. They're on the road against the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are going to be a 6-point home underdog. When it comes to passing game script, it really is irrelevant for the Cincinnati Bengals because they're going to be throwing the ball a ton regardless. When it does come to Boyd and Higgins, the only receivers we're considering starting, you do have to be weary about both their floor and their ceiling. From a volume perspective, they are going to be getting the targets, but we saw last week, even with Higgins, 10 targets only resulted in 3 receptions for 26 yards. Volume doesn't always equate to fantasy points. The New York Giants have only allowed a multi-TD game once this season, and it was in week 1. So plugging in both of these receivers and expecting big games for both of them, it's a bit silly. So we do have to drop them both in the rankings. Tyler Boyd, from that safe and consistent back-end wide receiver 2, we're bumping him down to a wide receiver 3. And Higgins, that matchup-based wide receiver 3 with upside, we're moving him down to more of a flex play. With a projected total of 43 points, we can't get excited for the New York Giants receivers either. Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, while still in play as flexes, their floors can definitely be called into question, especially more so on the side of Slayton. Slayton, we've seen his floor get extremely low. Sterling Shepard, while even though he is dealing with injuries, he's had 6 or more receptions in 5 of 6 games this season. This does make him the more high floor player out of the two, but we still have Darius Slayton ranked a bit ahead of him just due to the upside he brings in every possible matchup. The next matchup we have is the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Atlanta Falcons. In this matchup, while simple on paper when it comes to which players you're starting or sitting, obviously Julio, Ridley, they're auto starts, and the Las Vegas Raiders, they're really players we don't want to start unless we're in a desperate situation, and with no bye weeks this week, you likely have better options. But it is worth noting that the Atlanta Falcons rank top 5 in allowing fantasy points to wide receivers, so Henry Ruggs, although he's coming off of a 1 target, 1 reception game, he's definitely a player that still brings upside to the table. Nelson Agholor, while very inconsistent game by game, he's still the top producer from a receiver standpoint on this team, so starting him I could understand as well. Both players are risky. I would likely veer far away from that, but if you had to, if you're dealing with a ton of injuries yourself, I could also understand it. For Atlanta, the part that makes this a bit murky is that both Calvin Ridley and Julio are dealing with injuries. Julio Jones is even a game time decision at this point, but I gotta say, if Julio does start, you basically are forced to put him in. You may not like it. If you get results like you had last game, it'll probably make you sick, but at this point in the season, leaving Julio on your bench, and if you see him posting one of his better games even while he's banged up, it's not going to surprise us, and it's going to feel really gross on Sunday. The next matchup we have is the Miami Dolphins versus the New York Jets. The New York Jets are going to be 7-point home underdogs in this one, which, while typically promoting a positive passing game script, we can't say it overall is going to be a massive bump for the receivers around them because they're trailing in nearly every game. The Miami Dolphins, while not overall very strong against wide receivers, they really can exploit terrible passing offenses, so I wouldn't be surprised if the New York Jets passing offense does struggle in this matchup, but we still have Jamison Crowder and Brashad Perriman ranked as low-end flex options this week. They are ranked near back-to-back, so starting one over the other, we really don't think you can go wrong, but you really can't go right either. On the other side of the ball for Miami, there's really only one receiver we're trusting, that's Devontae Parker. Even in a game in which the offense struggled immensely, Devontae Parker still nabbed 6 of his 9 targets and even reached the end zone. With better offensive performances and likely one this week, Devontae Parker will be a top 30 option, but we of course do have to be a bit weary of his upside. The next matchup we have Arizona Cardinals on the road against New England. Arizona is coming into this matchup as road favorites. DeAndre Hopkins, as we know, he's an auto start. We have him ranked as a top 3 receiver this week, but what may surprise you is that Christian Kirk we have is a very solid start as well. New England, they are known for being a very stingy defense against both opposing wide receivers as well as rushers at times, but over the past 3 weeks, they've been as beatable as ever that we've seen on this season. Over the past 3 games, they've allowed an average of 12 receptions to the wide receiver position. A grand total of 7 touchdowns to wide receivers have been allowed through that same span. So Christian Kirk, while his results have been a bit underwhelming as of late, a bounce back game is definitely in the cards for him this week. We have him ranked just inside the top 30. On the other side of the ball for New England, Jacoby Myers, who was a very talented prospect and player we could begin to trust, he sort of let us down last week with 3 receptions, 38 yards, but even with that, he's still going to be the highest ranked New England receiver, even over Bird, who led the team in receiving a week ago. We aren't trying to chase the fantasy points with Bird. As for Myers, we do have him ranked just outside the top 36, so we're not all that excited about him either, but in a game with a 49.5 projected total, a game in which New England is expected to be trailing, there is some upside for both players in this matchup. The next game we have is the San Francisco 49ers on the road against the Rams. The Rams are are going to be 6.5-point favorites in this game, and even with San Francisco expected to be trailing, we're not going to waste your time here. We'll let you know we're not starting any San Francisco receiver. Nick Mullins, his play is questionable at best. He's still projected to be the starter. The LA Rams are really strong against opposing quarterbacks as well as wide receivers, ranking inside the top 3. So even if Debo does come back, his first game back from injury, we're not excited about thrusting him into the lineup and expecting solid results. Even though it's possible, there's just so many options out there. And Richie James, the player that did catch fire against Green Bay, we really didn't see him follow that up with a similar performance the following week, and with a matchup against the LA Rams, one of the best against receivers, putting him in and trusting him is just too risky for us to condone. As for the Rams, we can still put our faith in both Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, even though these players are heavy favorites in this game and the projected total is only 45 points, which isn't all that high. Kupp and Woods, they're coming off of a combined 28 targets against a stingy defense, and while San Francisco is a stingy defense themselves against wide receivers, with Nick Mullins slated as the starter, the time of possession may be much more lopsided than we expect. If that does happen, the floor of both Woods and Kupp, it will be increased, and they're already wide receiver 2s in their own rights. This week though, we expect Kupp to produce as a high end 2, Woods more that mid to back end 2, but both players you're putting in your lineup nonetheless. The next matchup we have is the New Orleans Saints on the road against Denver. Even with the Saints on the road, they're still 6-point favorites in this matchup, and as we know, Taysom Hill is projected to be the Saints starter. In his first game as the starter this season, Taysom Hill peppered Mike Thomas with targets. He finished the game with 12, which resulted in 9 receptions, over 100 receiving yards, which may make you guys overinflate the value of Michael Thomas this week. We just want you to know to be wary. The Atlanta Falcons defense, when compared to the Denver Broncos defense, it's night and day. So while Michael Thomas, you may want to automatically anoint him as a high-end wide receiver 1 option this week, we would like to trust him as nothing more than a back-end wide receiver 1 with upside. We can't forget that the projected total is one of the lowest on the week at 43.5 points, which means we're not trusting any other Saints receiver. But for Denver, there are still a couple of receivers you could trust in your flex spot. Jerry Jeudy, of course, being the leading receiver, we would have ranked the highest, still outside the top 40, but both KJ Hamler and Tim Patrick, while obviously not all 3 receivers will find success, if you do want to take a shot on one, each one of them has had their days from production versus volume, so catching lightning in a bottle with one of these receivers is definitely possible this week. The next matchup we have is Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus Kansas City. Kansas City will be the road team in this matchup, and this game has one of the highest projected totals coming in at 56 points. When it comes to Tampa Bay, while Kansas City has been very strong against opposing wide receivers, we saw last week against the Rams, Tampa Bay, they can still get it done regardless, even against these tougher defenses. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, as well as Antonio Brown, they're all players that everyone should be starting. Antonio Brown just around wide receiver 30, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans as those back-end wide receiver 2s. The floors for each of these receivers, they are a bit questionable, but the upside for each of them is also undeniable. When it comes to Mike Evans versus Chris Godwin, we're still going to start Godwin over Evans, but even if you have both, you're unlikely to be in a situation where you can only start one. This game has shootout written all over it, so I'm going to try to get in every Tampa Bay receiver I can, so all 3 of them we recommend starting. On the other side of the ball, unfortunately, not quite the same expectation. While Kansas City definitely has the ability to put up as many or if not more points than Tampa Bay, they are the favorites of course, but with Travis Kelce soaking up most of the consistent production as well as Tyreek Hill, it's tough to trust the other wide receiver pieces around them outside of those 2 players. For that reason though, Tyreek Hill, we have him ranked inside of the top 5, but no other wide receiver for Kansas City we're recommending starting. Alright guys, we're moving over to the next one, which is Chicago versus Green Bay. This is a divisional matchup in which it's very simple to break down from a receiver standpoint because we're only starting 2 players in this game. For Green Bay, of course, that would be Davante Adams. Adams we have ranked as the number 1 overall wide receiver this week. While Chicago is one of the worst wide receiver matchups we could ask for, Davante Adams is matchup proof. In the way Aaron Rodgers has been playing, it's definitely in MVP consideration. It is still a bit too early to trust Allen Lazard. We saw MVS and his floor dip back down to reality, so we're not trusting starting either of those 2 players, and that's very similar to what we see on the other side side for the Chicago Bears. The only player we're considering starting here is obviously Allen Robinson. There are two other receivers that some people could possibly consider, that being Anthony Miller, Darnell Mooney. We definitely wouldn't want to go there because Chicago doesn't have an Aaron Rodgers, and even with Allen Robinson, we've been seeing him being more of a high floor option, but we really haven't seen the ceiling for several weeks now. He's only scored one receiving touchdown since week 4 this season, and while one could say that he's due for it, the Green Bay Packers still rank inside the top 10 at mitigating fantasy points to wide receivers, and A-Rob isn't necessarily on a hot streak. We're moving into the final matchup, the Monday night matchup. It's the Seattle Seahawks on the road against the Philadelphia Eagles. This game should be pretty exciting. There should be some potential fireworks. It has a 50-point projected total, but every time we do see these two teams play, it's always a dogfight. As we know, the Seattle Seahawks, they give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so players like Jalen Reagor, Travis Fulgham, they are going to get a bump in the rankings as a result. Unfortunately for them though, the bump in the rankings, it is going to be a bit mitigated by how slow and stuttering this offense has been under Carson Wentz as of late. Both players are still in flex consideration, Jalen Reagor pushing more wide receiver 3 numbers, so each player, while we can recommend getting them into the lineup, they are going to come with a significant amount of risk. On the other side of the ball for Seattle, it's very simple, so we'll just close it out with this. Both Seattle Seahawks receivers, they're wide receiver 1s in this matchup, but that's no different than where we've ranked them for most of this season. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.